The first thing Frank Sullivan noticed wasn't her wounds. It was her laugh. Hollow, broken, like the sound death makes when it decides to take its time. His hand instinctively moved to the M1911 at his hip, the same sidearm that had saved his life in 3 different countries. 23 years in the SEALs taught him to recognize danger. But this wasn't danger approaching through the Montana dusk. This was desperation. A lone figure stumbled through the tall grass, her military jacket hanging in tatters, dark stains visible even from a distance. Blood. Frank recognized it instantly, had seen too much of it not to. She collapsed at the edge of his property, still clutching that jacket like it was the last piece of herself she had left. Her skin was bruised in precise patterns that spoke of methodical abuse, not random injury. Her bare feet were torn open, but it was her eyes that sent ice through Frank's veins. They weren't pleading or even angry. They were hollow, like the soul behind them had already retreated to somewhere unreachable. "You're on private property," Frank said, his voice steady but not unkind. She looked up at him, a bitter smile twisting her lips. "I'm just used goods," she laughed. "Nothing worth stealing here. Let me ask you this. If you found a shattered soul on your doorstep, would you turn away? Or would you do what Frank Sullivan did next?" Frank Sullivan was 58 years old, a man who had buried friends on 3 continents. After his wife Sarah died of cancer 6 years ago, he'd returned to resurrect his father's abandoned ranch, not just as a place to live, but as redemption for promises unkept. He thought he'd seen everything war could do to a person. He was wrong. He knelt beside her, close enough to help, far enough not to threaten. "What's your name, soldier?" he asked, recognizing the military bearing that remained despite her condition. Those hollow eyes focused slightly. "How did you know?" "The way you positioned yourself against the fence. Back protected, clear line of sight." Frank nodded toward her jacket. "And that's standard issue Army Medical Corps. Seen enough of them in field hospitals." She seemed to evaluate him with new interest. "Rebecca Hayes," she finally offered. "Former Army nurse, 2 tours in Afghanistan." Her voice cracked. "Though that seems like someone else's life now." "Frank Sullivan, SEAL Team 6, retired." He stood slowly. "I've got a spare room, medical supplies, and no questions until you're ready to answer them." That bitter laugh escaped her once more. "Why bother? I'm just used goods." Frank's eyes hardened as he helped her to her feet. "Ma'am, in my experience, human beings aren't goods. They're not products to be used. They're not property." His voice dropped lower. "And anyone who taught you otherwise has a lesson coming." By the 3rd day, Rebecca had eaten half a bowl of stew and changed into Frank's old flannel shirt. Small victories, but Frank had learned in combat that small victories often determined who lived and who died. As he entered the spare room with fresh coffee, she was sitting up, examining her bruises with clinical detachment. "Systematic," Frank observed, setting the mug down, "designed to maximize pain without leaving permanent damage." Rebecca's eyes met his, a flash of her professional assessment breaking through. "You've seen this before." "Enhanced interrogation. Wasn't called that when I was active, but same principle." Frank sat in the chair opposite her. "Who did this to you, Hayes?" Her hands clenched the blanket. "Coleman Security." The name hit Frank like a physical blow. Marshall Coleman. The memory flashed unbidden. The village outside Kandahar, 2010. Coleman giving the order to clear buildings before confirming civilian evacuation. Frank objecting. Coleman pulling rank. 3 dead children in the aftermath. "You know him," Rebecca said, reading his expression. "We served together. Joint operation in Kandahar." Frank's jaw tightened. "He made a call that cost innocent lives. I filed a report. Military buried it. Coleman came home decorated, Went private sector. And you? I came home with the knowledge I followed an order I knew was wrong. Frank's voice was flat. You carry that differently than medals. Rebecca nodded, understanding in her eyes. Coleman's running what he calls a treatment program for veterans with PTSD, especially women who served in medical roles. We've seen things, done things, that leave marks. Her voice strengthened with controlled anger. He promised healing, delivered something else entirely. How many others? At least 11 when I left. All women, all veterans, all alone. She looked out the window at the vast Montana landscape. He's building something bigger too, a compound north of here. Military-grade security for a supposed treatment facility. Frank stood, checking his weapon with the automatic precision of decades of training. I'm calling Sheriff Dawson. No! The panic in her voice stopped him. Coleman owns most of the county officials, sheriff included. Frank considered this, eyes scanning the horizon from habit. His ranch sat in a valley with clear sight lines in every direction. One reason he'd chosen it. Defensible. You're safe here, he said finally, for now. But both knew that for now was a promise with an expiration date. The confrontation came sooner than expected. The next morning, Frank was mending tack on the porch when the distinctive growl of a high-performance engine broke the silence. A black SUV with the Coleman Security logo emblazoned on the side rolled up to his gate. The man who stepped out moved with the precise efficiency that marked former special forces. Frank set his work aside, one hand casually dropping to his holstered M1911. Help you? Frank called, not rising from his seat. The man stopped at the gate. Wilson, Coleman Security, looking for a woman who went missing from our facility. Heard she might be out this way. Nobody here but me, Frank replied evenly. Wilson's hand drifted toward his concealed weapon. Mind if I take a look around? Company property went missing with her. In one fluid motion that belied his age, Frank was on his feet, covering the distance to the gate with predatory efficiency. Son, I've killed men for less than the implication you just made. His voice was conversational, almost friendly, which made the threat all the more chilling. Now, are you looking for a person or property? Because your answer determines what happens next. Wilson faltered, reassessing the older man. What he dismissed as a rancher was suddenly revealing itself as something far more dangerous. Look, old man! Frank's hand moved faster than Wilson could track. The younger man found himself disarmed, his own weapon now in Frank's possession, his wrists locked in a hold that sent white-hot pain up his arm. 23 years in the teams doesn't wash off, Frank said quietly. Tell Coleman if he wants to talk. He comes himself, man to man. As Wilson's SUV disappeared in a cloud of dust, Frank caught sight of Rebecca at the window watching. For the first time, her eyes weren't empty. They held something new, hope. Marshal Coleman arrived at sunset, his black Escalade flanked by 2 security vehicles. Frank watched their approach through binoculars, noting positions, weapons, tactical formation, old habits. Rebecca stood beside him on the porch, pale but composed. You should let me go with them, she said quietly. This land is your life's work. Frank lowered the binoculars. Land is dirt, timber, and water. Important, yes. Worth a human soul? No. Coleman stepped out of his vehicle, designer sunglasses catching the dying light. 2 armed men flanked him, positioned for maximum coverage. Frank noted their stance, their trigger discipline, the tactical earpieces, not rent-a-cops, former military. Sullivan, Coleman called, his voice carrying across the yard. You look like hell. Ranching doesn't suit you. Frank stepped off the porch, deliberately keeping his movements slow and non-threatening, but his eyes never left Coleman's hands. What do you want, Marshal? Coleman removed his sunglasses, revealing eyes as cold and calculating as Frank remembered. You know what I want. Hayes. She belongs to my organization. She doesn't belong to anyone, Frank replied. Coleman's smile never reached his eyes. That's where you're wrong. She signed a contract, 5 years of service in exchange for treatment. He gestured to the eastern edge of Frank's property. But I'm a businessman. I'm willing to deal. That creek parcel of yours, I want the water rights. Frank's jaw tightened imperceptibly. The creek supplied water to the entire ranch. Without it, the land his father had worked, the land he'd promised his dying wife he'd restore, would be worthless. Why that land? Frank asked, though he suspected the answer. I'm expanding operations, building something bigger than you can imagine, Sullivan. Coleman spread his hands. So here's my offer. Sign over the water rights, and Hayes's contract is torn up. She stays here playing house with you. Everyone's happy. And if I refuse? Coleman's face hardened. Then I file charges. Assault, theft, destruction of company property. With her psychiatric history, they won't even put her in prison. Just a padded room with enough drugs to make her forget her own name. Frank measured the distance to Coleman's security team, calculating angles, probabilities. 3 armed men. He'd faced worse odds, but not at 58, not with Rebecca's safety in the balance. I need time, Frank said finally. Until tomorrow morning, Coleman replied, replacing his sunglasses. For old time's sake. He turned to leave, then paused. You know, Frank, you could have been part of this. Instead, you're still clinging to outdated notions of honor while the rest of us profit. Is that what you tell yourself about Kandahar? Frank asked quietly. That it was profitable? Coleman's smile vanished. We completed the mission. 3 children died. Collateral damage. Coleman's voice was ice. Tomorrow morning, Sullivan. Don't make me come looking. As the vehicles disappeared down the road, Rebecca approached, her face pale. What are you going to do? Before Frank could answer, the sound of an approaching car caught their attention. A sleek silver Audi pulled up to the gate, and a young man in an expensive suit stepped out, looking distinctly out of place against the rugged Montana backdrop. Dad? He called, confusion evident in his voice. Frank's expression softened slightly. Ray, wasn't expecting you. Ray Sullivan made his way to the porch, his city shoes already gathering dust. At 28, he had his father's build, but his mother's softer features. Got a call from Mr. Harmon at the bank, he said without preamble. Said you're considering signing over the creek rights? Dad, that's half the value of this place. Frank glanced at Rebecca, who had gone very still. Ray, this is Rebecca Hayes. She's staying here for a while. Ray barely acknowledged her, his attention fixed on his father. Is this about her? Some woman shows up and you're ready to throw away everything you've worked for? Everything Mom wanted you to rebuild? Careful, son, Frank warned, his voice dropping to a register that made Ray step back instinctively. No, I won't be careful. You've spent 6 years rebuilding this place after Mom died. 6 years honoring her memory by restoring her family land. And now you're going to throw it all away? Your mother would be the first person to tell me to sign those papers, Frank said quietly. Sarah never valued land above people. Ray ran his hands through his hair in frustration. Then explain it to me. Make me understand why you do this. Frank exchanged a look with Rebecca, who nodded slightly. Let's go inside, Frank said. This is going to take a while. Over the next hour, Frank explained everything. Coleman's operation, Rebecca's escape, the ultimatum. With each detail, Ray's expression shifted from anger to disbelief, and finally to something like horror. So Coleman's basically running a human trafficking operation, using veterans? Ray asked when Frank finished. That's what it amounts to, Frank confirmed. Ray looked at Rebecca with new eyes. I'm sorry. For what I said earlier, I didn't understand. She nodded her acceptance. Have you gone to the FBI? Ray asked. This is federal-level stuff. Without evidence? Frank shook his head. It's our word against a respected businessman with government contracts. Ray was silent for a long moment, thinking. Finally, he said, I might be able to help. My firm has access to financial databases. If Coleman's operation is as big as you say, there will be a paper trail. For the first time in days, Frank felt a glimmer of hope. How quickly can you get those records? Give me 48 hours, Ray said, determination replacing his earlier anger. If there's anything to find, I'll find it. As Ray headed back to his car, promising to return soon, Frank felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Whatever came next, he wouldn't face it alone. And I ask you now, when everything you've worked for is threatened, when the legacy you've built stands on the edge of destruction, what would you sacrifice to do what's right? Would you have the courage to choose as Frank did? Or would the price be too high? Exactly 36 hours later, 12 hours ahead of schedule, Ray returned with a thick folder of financial documents. His expression was grim as he spread the papers across Frank's kitchen table. Coleman's operation is bigger than we thought, Ray explained, pointing to a complex web of shell companies and offshore accounts. He's building what amounts to a private army, ex-military personnel, advanced weapons, experimental behavior modification technology. What about the women? Rebecca asked quietly. Ray pulled out another document. Payments listed as long-term patient care, but the amounts are astronomical for legitimate medical treatment, and they're going to numbered accounts overseas. Hush money, Frank concluded, keeping families from asking questions. This is it, Rebecca said, hope kindling in her voice. This is what we need. Not quite, Ray cautioned. It's circumstantial. We need concrete evidence from inside that compound. Frank stood, decision already made. Then we get inside. Dad, that place is a fortress, Ray protested. Military-grade security, armed guards, surveillance systems. Frank opened a footlocker he'd retrieved from his closet, revealing carefully maintained tactical gear. I've breached worse, in countries where getting caught meant certain death. You're not a SEAL anymore, Dad. You're 58 years old. Frank removed a combat knife from the locker, testing its edge with practiced precision. Age gives perspective, son, not weakness. He looked up, eyes sharp with the focus of a predator. I didn't survive 3 wars by being easy to kill. A knock at the door interrupted them. Frank signaled for silence, drawing his sidearm as he moved to the window. After a moment, he holstered the weapon and opened the door. Sheriff Jack Dawson stepped inside, removing his hat. At 53, with close-cropped gray hair and the steady gaze of a career Marine, Dawson looked every inch the law enforcement officer. Sullivan, he nodded. Got a problem? Coleman, Frank asked. He filed for an emergency injunction this morning. Judge Harmon signed it, gives his security team authority to enter your property and remove Rebecca by force. When? Tomorrow at dawn. Dawson hesitated. Frank, I can stall them at the county line for maybe an hour, but after that... 1 hour is all we need, Frank said, meeting Dawson's eyes. But why help us, Jack? You're risking your badge. Dawson's expression hardened. My sister's boy came back from Afghanistan with PTSD. Signed up for Coleman's treatment program last year. We haven't heard from him since. His voice roughened. Official channels say he's receiving intensive care and can't have visitors. But I know a prison when I see one. This changed everything. Frank glanced at Ray and Rebecca. We move tonight. The plan came together with military precision. Frank would lead the infiltration, using his SEAL training to breach the compound's perimeter. Ray would handle the technical aspects, security systems, data retrieval, and Rebecca, with her medical training, would help identify and evacuate the other women. As darkness fell, Frank retrieved specialized equipment from his footlocker. night vision goggles, tactical communications, tools for covert entry. Equipment he'd never thought he'd use again, but had kept ready nonetheless. "Why did you keep all this?" Ray asked, watching his father prepare with methodical efficiency. "Because once you've seen the darkness in the world, you never quite believe it won't find you again." Frank checked his sidearm, the action smooth and familiar. Better to have and not need than need and not have. At midnight, they gathered for final preparations. Dawson would create a distraction at the main gate, while Frank, Ray, and Rebecca accessed the compound through a drainage culvert identified in satellite imagery. Before they moved out, Rebecca approached Frank on the porch where he stood watching the stars. "Why are you really doing this, Frank?" she asked quietly. "You've already lost your water rights. You could just let me go. Start over somewhere else." Frank's eyes remained on the stars. 20 years ago, outside Kandahar, I followed an order I knew was wrong. 3 children died because I valued the mission over the people we were supposed to protect. His voice was low, haunted. "Their faces are still the last thing I see before I fall asleep." He turned to her, his weathered face resolute in the moonlight. "I promised myself never again. Never put anything, orders, missions, land, above human dignity." Rebecca nodded, understanding in her eyes. "Then let's finish this." They moved through the Montana night like shadows, Frank in the lead, his movements silent and deliberate. Despite his age, he navigated the rough terrain with the fluid grace of a predator. Decades of training evident in every step. The compound rose before them, perimeter lights cutting through the darkness. According to Ray's intelligence, the facility housed at least 15 patients in underground levels, with Coleman's private quarters and operations center in the main building. "Security patrol," Frank whispered, dropping to a crouch behind a fallen log. An ATV rolled past on a dirt track 50 yards away. Guards scanning with thermal imaging equipment. When the patrol passed, they approached the drainage culvert. Frank deployed a fiber optic camera to check for sensors before signaling the all clear. The passage was tight and damp, but navigable. They emerged inside the compound's perimeter near a maintenance shed. "Main building is there," Frank whispered, pointing to a structure partially embedded in the hillside. 2 guards at the entrance, probably more inside. "Where would they keep the women?" Rebecca asked, her voice steady despite the danger. "Underground, more secure, harder to escape from." Frank studied the compound. "Ray, find the server room, download everything. Rebecca and I will locate the women." The plan worked flawlessly until they reached the 3rd security checkpoint. "Biometric scan required," the panel announced when Frank swiped a stolen access card. Before they could retreat, a door opened behind them. Frank turned, weapon ready, but froze when he saw who emerged. Marshal Coleman stood in the doorway, flanked by armed guards, his expression one of smug satisfaction. "Frank Sullivan, right on time." "You knew we were coming," Frank said, mind already calculating odds, escape routes, angles of fire. "The moment Dawson tried to stall my team, I knew exactly what you were planning." Coleman stepped closer. "Always so predictable, Frank. Always thinking you're the hero." "It's over, Marshal. We have the financial records, the shell companies, everything." Coleman appeared unconcerned. "Administrative errors, at worst. Nothing my lawyers can't handle." His gaze shifted to Rebecca. "Hello, Nurse Hayes. Ready to resume your treatment?" Rebecca straightened, facing her tormentor without flinching. "There are no treatments here, just torture and trafficking. And now we have proof." Coleman's smile faltered slightly. "What proof?" As if on cue, alarms blared throughout the facility. Emergency lights flashed as the security system went into lockdown. "That would be my son," Frank said, allowing himself a small smile. "Ray has a way with computers." The momentary distraction was all Frank needed. With the swift, economical movements that had once made him one of the military's most effective operators, He disarmed the nearest guard and used him as a shield against the second. Coleman reached for his weapon, but Frank was faster. 23 years of combat hadn't slowed his reflexes. A precise strike to Coleman's wrist sent the gun clattering to the floor. "Not this time," Frank growled, forcing Coleman against the wall. "Not ever again." Coleman's face contorted with rage. "You were always so righteous, Sullivan, so convinced you were better than the rest of us. But we both know the truth about Kandahar. We both know what you did." "You're right," Frank said, his voice steady. "I followed your order. I put the mission above innocent lives, and I've lived with that every day since." His grip tightened. "But unlike you, I learned from it." As Frank secured Coleman with zip ties, Rebecca was already moving deeper into the facility. She found the secured ward and began freeing the women inside. There were 11 of them, just as she'd said. Some wore vacant expressions that reminded Frank too much of Rebecca when he'd first found her. Others showed a spark of hope as Rebecca quickly explained who she was and why they were there. "We need to move," Frank urged, helping a particularly weak woman to her feet. Ray's distraction won't hold forever. Leading the group through the now chaotic facility proved challenging. Many of the women were weak or injured, and security personnel were responding to multiple alarms. Frank used every trick he'd learned in decades of covert operations, finding alternate routes, creating distractions, neutralizing threats with precise, non-lethal force. They were nearly at the exit when they encountered Sheriff Dawson, flanked by deputies with weapons drawn. "Sullivan," Dawson said, his expression unreadable. "Should have known you'd be in the middle of this mess." Frank tensed, positioning himself between the women and potential threat. "Jack," he acknowledged cautiously. To his relief, Dawson holstered his weapon. "FBI's 10 minutes out. Ray contacted them directly with the evidence." A hint of a smile crossed the sheriff's weathered face. "I'll take Coleman. You get these women to safety." Outside, Ray was waiting with vehicles he'd commandeered. The rescued women were quickly loaded in, Rebecca moving among them, providing emergency care. As they drove away from the compound, now swarming with law enforcement, Frank caught Rebecca's eye in the rearview mirror. For the first time since he'd found her stumbling across his land, she smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. "Thank you," she said simply. Frank nodded, words unnecessary between them. They both understood what had happened here, what had been balanced. 3 months later, Frank stood on his porch, watching the sun rise over his land. The creek that ran through the eastern parcel sparkled in the early light. Water rights now legally restored to the Sullivan Ranch, following Coleman's arrest and the seizure of his assets. Rebecca stepped out, 2 cups of coffee in hand. She'd stayed on after the raid, dividing her time between the ranch and a clinic in town where she provided counseling to veterans. The hollow look in her eyes was gone, replaced by purpose and strength. "Ray called," Frank said, accepting the coffee. "He's coming for the weekend. Says he wants to learn more about ranching." Rebecca smiled. "He's a good son." "Better than I deserve," Frank admitted. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the land come alive with morning light. The ranch was healing, just as they were. "I've been thinking about what you said before the raid," Rebecca said finally, "about balancing scales." Frank waited, giving her space. "I don't think scales ever really balance," she continued thoughtfully. "I think we just learn to carry them differently." She turned to look at him directly. "You saved more than my life, Frank. You saved who I am, who I can still become." Frank considered her words. "You saved me too," he said quietly. "Reminded me what matters." Rebecca's hand found his, a gesture not of romance, but of something deeper, a connection between 2 people who had seen darkness and chosen light instead. "Land can be taken and restored," Frank said, looking out over his ranch. "But human dignity, once stolen, is harder to recover." He squeezed her hand gently. I'm glad you found yours again. Rebecca's smile held no bitterness now, only strength. I'm not used goods anymore, she said, echoing her words from that first encounter. I'm a survivor. And standing there as the Montana sun climbed higher, Frank Sullivan knew that some decisions, even the hardest ones that cost you everything you thought you valued, were worth making. Because in the end, it wasn't land or water or even legacy that defined a man's worth. It was the dignity he recognized in others and the lengths he would go to protect it. So let me ask you this. As our story comes to a close, what would you sacrifice for what truly matters? What decision would you make when everything you've built stands in the balance against another soul's dignity? The answer to that question defines not just who we are, but who we choose to become. And in a world that often forgets the value of human dignity, that choice might be the most important one we ever make. Music fades in softly. Folks, if this story spoke to you today, if it reminded you of the tough choices we all face and the value of standing up for what's right, I hope you'll take a moment to hit that subscribe button. Here at Frontier Tales, we bring you stories of men and women who face impossible odds with courage and integrity, the kind of stories that remind us of who we really are. Every week, we share a new tale from America's heartland, stories about veterans finding their way home, fathers and sons rebuilding what was lost, and good men standing against corruption and evil, just like Frank Sullivan did. If you know someone who might need to hear this message, maybe an old buddy from your service days or a son who's trying to find his way, share this video with them. Sometimes the stories we tell each other are the maps that help us find our way back to what matters. Until next time, this is Thomas Walker for Frontier Tales, reminding you that in a world that's changing faster than we sometimes like, the values that make a man worthy of respect never change. Courage, sacrifice, and recognizing the dignity in every human soul. God bless, and I'll see you on the trail next week.